All right. Finishing up chapter 2 in your NASM textbook, the basic exercise science chapter. This is the third half of the kinetic chain, right? So we are looking at the muscular system today. And so again, our purpose of this, this entire last 3 days, our purpose of this series has been to, have a fundamental understanding of the structure of our kinetic chain, right? We talked about the nervous system, which is going to control the entire kinetic chain, the skeletal system, which gives us our framework. But now we are diving into the main system that is responsible for actually doing the moving, right? So after this presentation, we'll be able to kind of describe the structure and the function of our muscular system and how that muscular system sort of adapts and how it responds to the wares of everyday life. So if we are looking at defining our muscular system, sort of by definition here, right, it's a series of muscles that are going to move your skeleton. So, just like any other system, this system is made up of a bunch of individual organs all working together. And those individual organs are going to be each and every one of your individual muscles. And that sounds a little bit weird. Like a lot of times when I describe like organs and organ systems, it sounds a little weird because you're like, I think of organ systems, I think of my digestive system, or my heart, working with my lungs, right? But your muscular system is a series of organs working together. It's just, an organ is nothing more than like a grouping of like a bunch of tissue. And, there's a lot of muscle tissue all grouped together that forms up my bicep or my tricep or my pectoralis major or my, upper trapezius muscles, right? My masseter, like whatever, right? And all those muscles, every one of those is going to come together to allow me to talk right now, to move my head, to move my arms up and down, bend my elbows, do all of these like individual movements. So it is the system is a series of muscles that are going to, manipulate your skeleton. They are moving your skeleton around. Your skeleton's acting as like the nice hard levers for you to kind of be able to manipulate. And we're using the muscles to sort of do that manipulation. So how muscles do that is they are going to generate their own internal tension, and that internal tension is going to overcome some sort of external stimulus, right? So that internal tension that's generated is going to manipulate for a greater amount of force than the resistance that's maybe tied to something. So if I had like a 5-pound dumbbell in my hand right now, and my deltoid muscle generated 6 pounds of internal tension, that's greater than this 5-pound dumbbell. And so then I can raise it against gravity, right? I'm being resisted by gravity, but I'm generating enough internal tension to overcome that, right? That's why, and that's what allows us to move. And it's, that does cause, that is like a lot of effort. And, these muscle fibers are pulling and they're getting, frayed and torn a little bit and damaged depending on how hard you're, sort of working against those resistive forces. And that's what sort of causes you to develop strength. That's why I'm so freaking sore today. I like killed it on leg day yesterday. Now I'm sitting here on camera paralyzed. I'm like, just even adjusting, I'm like, oh God. So, like there is like a lot of really fun biology that kind of happens here, right? And so your muscular system is what sort of generates that internal tension. It is under the control of your nervous system. So your nervous system is telling your muscular system how it's supposed to move. And remember that could be your somatic nervous system. You could consciously choose to move something, right? Very easily. But there is also the autonomic parts of it as well. There are autonomic parts of your nervous system that are controlling your muscles, I mean, your heart is actually, considered heart muscle, and that's under the control of your autonomic nervous system as well. So one of the biggest things that we're going to be talking a lot about today is we're going to be looking at the ideas of muscle fibers. So when we do zoom in, and we are going to zoom in really microscopically, we're going to get real deep inside of a muscle cell. We do have a special term for muscle cells, and we're going to call those muscle fibers. Which is just the individual muscle cell itself. It's a special name because it just looks a little bit different than your typical like animal cell. And so because it looks slightly different, they kind of give it a special name. So the muscle fiber is the individual cells we're going to be talking about. So, you know, what a muscle is, right, is it's just a bunch of muscle fibers all coming together. But in a lot of tissues, when cells just kind of come together, they kind of just form like a nice even layer, right? Sometimes we'll call that like epithelial tissue. And epithelial tissue is a good example. Like your skin's a really good example of this, right? And it's just basically where, you know, you'll have like, you know, maybe squamous epithelial tissue, which is like the flat stuff, or you'll have like stratified versions, or, you know, columbar versions. Columbar versions are really thick stuff. So, you know, there's lots of different types of like epithelial tissue out there. That's making up like all, you know, it's just a bunch of cells stacked next to each other. It's really kind of quite simple, right? There's a little, you know, square shaped cell, but it's got a nucleus, it's got all the normal stuff you're going to see inside of it, right? Stacked next to that one, and then boom, you got tissue, right? Muscles are a little bit different. Muscles are a little bit more complicated. Muscles are a bunch of muscle cells in an arrangement, and then they're all kind of bundled up together. And so, you know, and honestly, I have not used this example before, but it kind of looks something kind of like this. It's a bunch of, I didn't know what was at the bottom of my pen cup. Actually, I have a lot of change in it. I'm rich, guys. I got a whole like $2 in there. So you can see, you can if you sort of bundle all these things together, right? Each of these little individual like fibers, if I bundle them like this, right? That's sort of what your muscles actually kind of look like if you really zoom in. So there's sort of a bundle, all the individual little muscle fibers are bundled up together with a whole bunch of other muscle fibers, right? And they all kind of stack together. And they stack in this big bundle. We call that a fascicle. We'll look at that term here in just a minute when we get to it. But you know, that fascicle is it's a bundle of individual muscle cells. And then what's kind of cool is that fascicle will be bundled up with a bunch of other fascicles. So you'll have like, you know, one fascicle here, right, which has got all these muscle cells in it, and then there'll be another one right here, and then like that'll be all tight, and then another one, and then all of that will be wrapped together. And that's actually what we see in our actual muscle. It's a bundle of a bundle of a bundle of individual little muscle cells, which is pretty freaking cool when you look at it. And that arrangement is what allows us to be able to, you know, maybe we experience a little bit of cellular damage. You know, you work out really hard and you get really sore, right? Some of your muscle fibers are going to get damaged, right? But not all of them, and that way like that muscle can still move. You know, you're not tearing through an entire like one section of tissue, you know. You're just damaging little tiny bundles, and so those are little fibers within the bundles, and then those little fibers get repaired while the other ones sort of take over and they do the job for now, and then eventually they're all really much stronger, and you know, they continue working and you develop strength over time. So the muscular system is really, really cool, and it's one of my favorites to talk about. But at the heart of what it is a compilation of many individual muscle fibers neatly wrapped together with connective tissue to form bundles. So the first bundle, the outermost, and we went from small and worked our way out. Let's work our way from out and we'll go to small. So the first bundle, right? The overall like wrapping of the muscle itself, that is going to be called your fascia, right? So there's some connective tissue on the outside of your muscles called your fascia. So if you look at muscle fascia, oh, that's actually a great picture right there. You can actually see like it's sort of this like silver webbing that sort of lays on the outside of our muscles. And that fascia is there to act as a protective layer to keep all of the sort of arrangement of your muscle fibers going in the right direction. You know, I don't know if anybody in here woodworks, but when you're woodworking, you're not supposed to sand against the grain, and at least you're not supposed to leave it that way. You know, you go with the grain when you're sanding. That's how you get something nice and smooth. Same thing, you know, you got to grain to your muscles, right? Dalen, Andres, you guys are my resident massage folks, right? You go with the grain. I mean, sometimes you'll go against, right? But for the most part, you usually go with the grain of the muscle, right? Your fascia allows that muscle to kind of sit in the direction it's supposed to go. And, and we've definitely heard of like fascia being a bad guy. I'm sure you guys have heard of like plantar fasciitis or IT band syndrome. You'll hear that sometimes, which is sometimes it's called runner's knee or runner's hip. You'll get, your fascia will tighten up, and then that starts rubbing, sort of pinching between like the soft tissue of your muscles and your bones and stuff. And that's not ideal. But generally, fascia is a really good thing, and it's this outer layer protecting us. You've seen fascia if you've ever been cutting like a steak or a chicken breast, and you've seen that sort of silver skin. That's the outermost layer. So you can see these bundles that we're looking at, the outermost layer, right? That's going to be our fascia, and it's a connective tissue that binds all of our muscles together and makes sure that our muscles sort of move in the direction that they're really intended to move. Then that's not necessarily fully part of the muscle that we're talking about. Like if we're talking about an individual muscle, that's not really fully part of the muscle. It's connective tissue surrounding the muscle, but they work very intimately together. The next most layer is around like sort of the epicenter of the muscle itself. We call that the epimysium. And you're going to see a lot of like mesiums and mysiums and myos and things like that today. Whenever you hear the prefix like myo or meso or something like that, we're referring to like we're in muscle territory, right? Same thing with sarco. Sarco comes from the Latin word meaning flesh. And then myo comes from the Latin word meaning muscle. So, the epimysium, right, is the epicenter of like muscle tissue. And so that's the outermost layer of the muscle itself. So the overall muscle being sort of, all a bunch of bundles of fascicles, right? That is the outer walls of your muscle itself. And it'll look something kind of like this. We look at like muscle fiber. That's close. That is a good picture. There we go. This is the one I love. Yeah. All right. So we can see there is our sort of fascia that's kind of surrounding everything, right? And then we got this outer layer on the outside. That's your epimysium, right? It's kind of bundling the whole muscle fiber. And so it's a wrapper underneath another wrapper, which is it's a really good thing we've got all this, because that's what's keeping our muscles, move in the direction we're supposed to go. You don't want to like, drag a muscle over a bone and all of a sudden get our fibers wrapped around that bone or something and then get tangled. Like that would be really bad, So luckily we've got this wrapper, and then we got another wrapper on top of that that's a little bit more, little tougher, right? The fascia is real tough. So that's your epimysium. So then if we zoom in a little bit, our next layer is what's going to wrap around the fascicle itself, right? So remember, I said a fascicle is a bundle of muscle fibers. So if you look right here, you can see this is a fascicle, right? That's a whole bunch of muscle fibers all sort of being bundled together here, right? So there's a fascicle, right? And then here's one that they kind of pulled out here, right? So here's this big fascicle, right? So it's got a layer around the outside. It's got a wrapper that sort of separates it from the other fascicles, right? And that is going to be your paramecium. Okay, so the paramecium is the layer that wraps around the perimeter of your individual muscle fascicles, right? So that's that layer right there. And then, like I said, each muscle fascicle is nothing more than a bunch of other muscle cells all bundled together. So here's a muscle cell, here's a muscle cell, there's another one, right? And they're all bundled together. So when we pull one out, right, here's our individual muscle cell, right? You can see this is just a tiny little muscle cell all by itself. It's got its little mitochondria, it's got nucleuses, right? All the normal stuff you're going to see inside of a cell. So its outermost layer, which is at this point very inner, right? We're very much on the inside, very zoomed in, on our muscles here. That layer is going to be called your endomysium. And the endomysium is basically the cell wall just like any other normal cell wall. Like if we look at an animal cell, you know, this is just sort of a textbook, sort of classic biology animal cell here. You know, it's got a little wall around the outside of it that separates stuff from one side to the other. Well, that has a special name in muscle fibers. We call it the endomysium. Now, you might be wondering, for those of you who are new, you might be wondering, you're like, okay, well, we explained, like, you know, we got this big bundle here, and that's got all these little tiny ones inside of it, right? Like this big guy is made up of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 like fascicles, right? And then each fascicle has like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 to maybe 15 muscle fibers in it, right? So there's, you know, all the individual muscle fibers. We zoomed in on that, right? Fascicle, muscle fiber, right? But what about all these little circles, right? Like, what are all these extra ones, right? Like, is there another layer? Well, yeah, kind of. There actually kind of is. There's another, even more microscopic layer inside of every individual muscle cell. And that is called a myofibril. And it's this big thing that stretches from end to end. So, you know, here's a classic animal cell, right? But if you were to take this and just stretch it out into sort of like a cylinder shape, and then if you ran these special little rods all the way through it, right? Like imagine I took this circle, I stretched it out into a tube, and now it, you know, kind of looks like a muscle fiber. It looks really long like this, and then I just threaded these little proteins inside of it. You know, all sort of bundled together, right? And then on those proteins, there are these little things that can crawl across each other. So they can kind of go like this. And what happens is when that protein moves, the length of your cell, which, you know, was originally this long, can actually shorten. And so then that cell actually shortens a little bit like this, and then it can relax. It can get back to its original length. So, you know, this classic animal cell looks very different here, right? You can see, like, see that little thing right there? That's this big circle right here. And then you notice there's lots of them, right? Well, there's multiple nuclei within your muscle cells. And then we see this, right? See these little, like, I don't know, they look like potato bugs to me. Those are your mitochondria, right? There's the little like mitochondria. So all the normal stuff here in a normal animal cell is present within a muscle fiber, plus the addition of these myofibrils, these little rods that have little proteins that live on them. And those proteins, they grab each other and they pull. And then these guys pull this way, and these guys pull that way. And so the muscle cell goes like this. And then that happens in the muscle cell over there, and that happens in the muscle cell over there. So then all of these muscle cells are shortening. So this muscle cell will reduce in length, and then so will all of these muscle cells in this fascicle. And then all these other fascicles are also making their muscle cells shorten. And so the entire length of my muscle sort of shortens, right? And that's why we see, you know, it goes from being nice and long like this, and then it bunches up, right? It bunches up like that, and then it goes back to normal, right? It bunches up and it goes back to normal because it's being shortened. And that shortening is pulling my skeletal system. How are we feeling about that so far, guys? Pretty good?
Yeah.
Saeed, Habbe, how
amazing.
Are you moving quick? Feeling good?
Yep. God bless. Yeah. Thank you.
All right.
It was really amazing.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get it into some note version. Let's make it a little bit more approachable, right? So you're probably not going to need to have like these layers super memorized or anything, guys. If anything, they'll ask you about like what a fascicle is, which is a bundle of muscle fibers. That's a term that I've definitely seen on NASM tests before, but for the most part, they're not going to be, you know, they're not going to say this best describes the paramecium, you know. That's probably not a definition you're going to have to necessarily have memorized, but understanding this layering fashion is really important because like that is how our entire muscles work. It's a layer of a layer of a layer of a layer, you know. All right, so then all of your muscles are going to end, and I love that we got a little bit of that in this picture here. All of your muscles will get tighter and tighter and tighter until eventually they become a totally different type of tissue, because they look very, you know, we name tissues based on how they look, like what their characteristics are. And so what will happen is they'll get tighter and tighter and tighter, and then they'll get this really cool fibrous webbing that will actually insert onto a bone. So if actually tendon tissue, yeah. Come on, Google. No, we don't want to look up pictures of actual tendons. This isn't that type of anatomy class. Yeah, it's not bad, I guess. So this will actually kind of work. So you can see here, like what'll happen is like your muscle will get really tense, and then it gets really fibrous, and it's not actually exactly what I want. And what it'll do is you can kind of see it. The webbing looks very different, right? And that webbing will actually grab on, there we go, that kind of works, I guess, onto your bones. And so you can see it starts to kind of thread itself into all the individual, like sort of the honeycomb shape of your bones. It really kind of gets itself threaded in there. And so it gets stuck really well. This is a weird question for you guys, but has anybody in here, if you've ever taken like a pumice stone, sometimes people use them to like exfoliate their hands and stuff. Weird question, but have you ever tried to lick one of those things? I know it's a very odd question, but if you've ever if you press your tongue into it, your tongue is soft and it'll actually thread itself between that sort of spongy shape, and it'll stick to it almost like you're like licking like ice, and it'll like you can pull your tongue away and it'll kind of pull on your tongue. Fun fact, that's actually one of the ways you can test to tell if you found dinosaur bone when you were out in like in Montana. If you're ever like walking through like the Badlands of Montana and you're like, that rock kind of looks like a bone. Is it a rock or is it a bone? And you lick it and your tongue sticks to it, it's a bone because it's holy. It's got little like pores in it, whereas rock doesn't. Weird fun fact for the day. Totally unrelated to our talk on muscles, but there's your fun dinosaur fact for the day. So you're threading it in there. That's kind of what your tendons do. They're threading themselves into all the little porous nature of your bones, right? And so that tendon is the connective tissue that connects your muscle to your bones, right? So this tendon, look at how long this tendon is, right? Remember, we talked about this yesterday, right? This tendon does not grab this bone here. It runs over top of it. I kind of hate this drawing, actually. It runs over top of it and it grabs the tibia down here. So this is a really long tendon, right? And so, it's got to be really tense and it's got to get a really good grip. So this is definitely a key term you guys are definitely going to want to have memorized. A tendon is connective tissues that attach your muscles to your bones, right? They provide the anchor for which your muscles, when they pull, are connected to your bones. And so it manipulates that skeletal system. It moves that, right? So it attaches muscles to bones. Now, things to be aware of, they do have limited blood flow. That's why we kind of draw, that's why they're actually kind of whitish in color, sort of a white yellowish color. They look like that because they don't have any blood in them. So because of their limited blood flow, your tendons are susceptible to much slower repair and much slower adaptation. So here's sort of a misunderstanding in the world of like steroids, for instance. So for the record, steroids are always going to be bad. But one thing that is used to kind of scare people from doing steroids, they'll say it strengthens your muscles, but it doesn't strengthen your connective tissue. And so then like you might get a really strong muscle that pulls your connective and tears your connective tissues. You'll pull a muscle because of steroids, right? You'll hear that sometimes. So that's not scientifically very accurate. At least it's not described very accurately. Here's the thing. Again, steroids are bad for you for 1,000 reasons. But steroids make everything grow faster. So your connective tissue will actually get stronger. It's still going to grow just like anything else will, while you're under, anabolic steroids, But if you think about like, if I had something that, grew by units, like 5 units, right? Versus something that doesn't get as much blood flow. And so it only grows by 2 units. And then I make both of them grow 200% faster. Well, then that 5 became 20, and that 2 only became 6, right? That's now there's a huge discrepancy between one and the other. So it's not that it doesn't strengthen your connective tissue, but the reason I'm saying all this is because it gets less blood flow, it isn't going to get as large as quickly. And so they're usually not able to keep up. And that's why we see a lot of pulled muscles and tendon ruptures in athletes who take steroids. You see it all the time. And then they'll take steroids to come back from that injury faster, which is also not awesome. So yeah, just stay away from those things in general. But I use that to kind of highlight the fact that like tendons, they just don't get very much blood, so they repair much more slowly. This is why we kind of need to be cautious. We got to make sure that we are, strengthening our connective tissue instead of just strengthening muscle tissue. How do we do that? Well, we are going to do like plyometrics, which are a really great way to do that. We are going to do balance exercises, which put you into awkward ranges of motion, which cause your tendons to get a little bit more pull and stretch, which drives blood into them. And we're going to move at very slow tempos. We're going to move it kind of reduced tempos, and that way we spend a lot of time under tension, which gives blood time. It gets exposed to our muscle first, and then it can trickle into our tendons and stuff. And so we're going to see that whenever we do high repetition, slow tempo, unstable exercises, which for those of you who have been through our program design classes, you know that I'm talking about the stabilization phase within our training templates, right? So those are your tendons in a nutshell. Any questions so far on the gross anatomy? Any questions on the big stuff so far?
No.
Yep.
Cool. All right, let's take a look at muscle fiber. Let's zoom in. You're like, aren't we zoomed in already? Let's zoom all the way in and look at these muscle fibers. Remember, I said they're just like any other animal cell, except that they got some special characteristics, right? So you're going to see, we see like a muscle fiber, a muscle cell, it's going to contain all the normal stuff that you see, right? It's, when we look at an animal cell, I'm just going to give you a brief tour here. If we look at a classic cellular biology cell, right? These are all the little organelles that live inside that, right? So we can see here's the nucleus, right? It's the head honcho, sort of in charge of making all the decisions. You can see here's all your Golgi apparatus here, right? That's going to help you create assemble certain things, right? So Golgi apparatus is basically kind of give you a structure, keeps your cells open and shaped. Then we're going to see over here, we're going to see what's called your ER, your endoplasmic reticulum, which is a crazy weird name. There's two versions of it. There's smooth stuff and there's rough stuff. The rough stuff is working with the nucleus. You can see here is your mitochondria. This is producing energy to keep your cells alive, let them do all their jobs. And then in the cell itself is all of this fluid. So because, we got to be able to get sugars and proteins and fats and minerals and vitamins and stuff like that. We got to be able to kind of transport that around our cell. Let's say a vitamin gets sucked in over here, and now there's a little vitamin, I don't know, B over here, right? So that B vitamin needs to work its way over to the mitochondria. So luckily, this is all filled with fluid. This is a wet, swampy environment that makes it really easy for, that B vitamin to kind of get carried around and flow through the water of our cell into the mitochondria. Now it can kind of help our mitochondria produce energy, right? So all of your cells are this kind of wet, swampy environment. Well, muscle cells are no different. They are also a wet, swampy environment. And so, but because muscle cells are special and we like to name stuff with special names, the cellular plasma, that liquid, right, gets a special name here. Instead of calling it cytoplasm, which is just cell water, right, this is going to be referred to as sarcoplasm, which actually roughly translates to flesh water, which is gross term, but but that's the fluid within your muscle cells. That's your sarcoplasm. Okay, it's the liquid portion of our muscle cells, and this is going to contain all kinds of materials, right? Like I said, it's going to contain sugars. We're going to call that glycogen. It's going to contain fats. It's going to contain minerals, and it's going to contain this really cool protein called myoglobin, which is a protein of iron that actually carries oxygen around the muscle cell. So, if I need to be able to get a little bit of oxygen over to one of my mitochondria so my cell can breathe, that myoglobin is going to carry it. So that's the sarcoplasm inside of a muscle cell. Now, we're also going to see that your cells have nuclei, which is sort of like I said, the nucleus of the brain is the brain of your cell, right? So if we look at fiber organelles. I just need one. And I need sort of a basic one. There we go. So you can see here, right? There's a little nucleus in there, right? And then there's our mitochondria, right? Like I said, there's a much blown up larger version of the mitochondria, right? There's your nuclei, right? Kind of telling your muscle cell how it's supposed to grow, gives it something to control. And then you've also got, like I said, mitochondria. Mitochondria are these little, potato bug shaped things. This is producing energy. Whenever you break down carbohydrates to produce like energy, your mitochondria are what's doing that. And they're threaded throughout your muscle. Your muscle cells have some of the most mitochondria out of any type of cells in your body, next to your nervous system. Your nervous system is packed full of them. And then we have got myofibrils, and those myofibrils are the special proteins that I was mentioning earlier, right? So myofibrils, right? This is what we're seeing. This is what I actually had a hard time. I was trying to find this picture, but every time I looked up a picture, I kept finding stuff like this, where it was just these little like rods running throughout everything, right? And here's the thing, these rods are really, really important. This is why we're looking at them. But what a myofibril is, see if I can get a better picture. Yeah, there we go. Is it looks like this. It's this rod that really, it looks like what you think a muscle cell would look like, right? So it runs, throughout, there's your cell itself. And it's got so many little tiny rods that are running all the way through it, right? That's what a myofibril is, okay? So a myofibril is this big rod with all these little proteins attached running through it. So what they do is they contain even smaller proteins called myofilaments. And myofilaments are what live on the rod that allow the actual crawling to take place so that the rod can shorten. And then that shortens the whole muscle cell, right? So on your myofilaments, there are two primary types, okay? We can see this right here. And here, this is an individual myofibril, right? And then if you look, right, you can see like there's sort of these interesting little bands here, and then like kind of makes a zigzag, right? And then see these like lines that are kind of going this way, right? This is what happens when you zoom in on those lines. You'll actually see this kind of interesting, right? Like sort of, it almost looks like a Dr. Seuss tree, or what are those trees out here in California? Like the weird, what they're up and they got all the little like bulbous little branches. Like they're only here. Tree plant thingy. What's that called? The weird, they look like a freaking Dr. Seuss plant. Yeah, these things right here. So odd looking. They're like, you find them out in Joshua Tree all the time and stuff, but all right, well, now I'm just getting a lot of pictures of trees. Yeah, very odd looking, right? But they've got all these like little interesting kind of projections from them with all these little interesting little heads. Well, what if those heads had something to grab, right? What if they had like a little like slot that they could fit into, right? Well, then like when it fits into it, it can pull that and move the other one around, right? So it reaches its head up there and grabs it, and then moves it this way, right? And if that happens, and these little interesting little components here, if they reach up and grab and then they pull this way, they pull towards the middle, and then these guys reach up and they pull towards the middle, the entire thing is going to shorten. So these myofibrils, right, these myofibrils, which are tied end to end to end, have all these little proteins that are pulling in. And so you can see like this will, like this one here, actually, let's take this and we'll put it into paint. And sort of I'm describing this, right? So what can happen is this section right here, right? This section right in here, this can get pulled this way, and this one is going to get pulled this way. So that's going to shorten towards these thick bands right here. And then that same thing is going to happen over here, right? This one's going to get pulled this way, and this one's going to get pulled this way, and then that one that way, and that one that way, right? And so if this thing reduces its length by, let's say, 50%, and the same thing happens here, and the same thing happens here, well, then the entire myofibril shortens by about 50%. And then that happens in all of these other myofibrils at the same time in one muscle cell, right? And then that happens in all of your muscle cells simultaneously. And that's what shortens your muscles. So let's take a look at those little proteins a little bit better here, right? So myofibrils, right? That's the big rod that runs the entire length of each individual muscle cell. And there's lots of them all tied together. You're full of myofibrils inside of your muscle cells. And so those myofibrils are going to contain myofilaments, which are little itty bitty tiny proteins. And this is what you need to get memorized. These are the terms you're going to see. So of those two myofilaments, what you've got is you've got a really thin filament called actin. Actin is the thin filament that's sort of responsible for muscle contractions, right? So it is this kind of thin band that kind of just sits there, right? Like it's got all these little binding sites, right? And so it sits kind of like that, okay? So if we were sort of, if we were constructing a muscle here, we were constructing a muscle, right? We would start with like a, we'd create like an actin band, right? Oops. Okay, well, let's just do it this way. So we're going to create like a little, come on. Create a little actin band here. All right, that should be long enough for me to copy the whole thing. All right, and so it'll have about 2 layers of those binding sites. It'll have 2 layers of that. So it'll look kind of like this, right? So there's your actin band. It's this thin little band, and it's got all these little binding sites, right? Like each of these little individual binding sites are able to have something sort of attached to them, right? And so they're going to be arranged kind of like this. They're going to kind of sit like this. And so you'll have all these different bands sort of like stacked near each other, right? Meanwhile, you've got the exact same thing happening on the other side. So, these actin strands are probably like right over here. So there's all the thin filaments, right? These are all the binding sites. Now, you have also got this really thick filament that lives in the middle, okay? So you've got this really thick filament called myosin, okay? And you can see that here in this version, right? See the thick band here in the center, right? That's your myosin. And the myosin looks like that weird tree that I keep talking about. Myosin looks like that weird Joshua plant thingy, whatever it is. And it's got all these little like interesting little club-like heads that kind of branch off of it, right? So when you think about that, it looks something kind of like this, right? They're this, it's like this really thick band. You know, it kind of branches out like this, right? Really kind of thick there, right? And then it would be a little bit larger than that. There we go. And then it's going to have all these kind of interesting little club-like heads on it. And so those club-like heads are actually going to reach out. They're going to kind of look like this. So they got this little head on them, right? And then that one reaches out there. And it's got this little head on it, right? And then the same thing is happening here on the other side. Can I tell you guys how much faster this normally happens with a real whiteboard? So there's all of our myosin strands here, right? So there's myosins, all these little heads. All right, now I gotta move this thing. In between right here. Oh God. It's can I do this actually? Freeform. Let's see if this works. All right, that'll work. So it kind of lives like that, right? What? Why didn't it? What? All right. We're gonna have one myosin strand because I'm not doing that again. So there it kind of lives in between, right? Now what'll happen is these heads are gonna reach up. They'll reach up like that, and then they're gonna pull this way. So what'll happen is this strand is going to pull in this direction, and this strand is going to pull in that direction. There's sort of a thick divider sort of in the middle of these, right? So now that muscle cell is going to shorten, right? It's going to go from one end to the other, and that's going to happen. That right there is exactly how every muscle in your entire body, every muscle contraction you've ever created has happened, because actin, which is the thin filament that has binding sites that myosin is attracted to. Myosin's going to reach up and bind that. It's got these thick heads that will reach out. They will bind to the actin, and they will draw it closer to the center. And the entire area where this happens, like what we drew right here, right? This entire area where this is occurring, that is referred to as your sarcomere. And that term right there, the sarcomere, is probably sort of the most important part. This is probably the most important term in terms of like creating muscular contractions. You wouldn't be able to contract your muscles without these sarcomeres. That is what gives us our entire ability, right? It's because this has an actin and myosin strand, and then there's another one over here and another one over here. There's a bunch of sarcomeres. So a sarcomere is not like a physical thing. Don't think of a sarcomere as like something, you know, tangible, like a piece of your anatomy. It's more like a section. It's the section where actin and myosin are crossing over one another. Okay, it's the section where they live. It's an area of town, you know, an area within each of the individual myofibrils. Now, because these proteins are really attracted to each other, like myosin, like, you know, the classic example, it's like a love story. Like myosin really wants to reach up and grab actin all the time. They're really, really, really attracted to one another. So because of that, if they could have their way, they would just be contracted 24 hours a day. They would just squeeze and stay binded and stay bound. They would just kind of stay that way forever. But, you know, we need to be able to relax our muscles and, you know, let our arm down, right? We don't want to just be able to squeeze something and we're just stuck like that forever, right? We want to be able to kind of relax our muscle, right? Well, luckily we're able to do that because there are these regulatory proteins that are actually living on the actin strand and they block those binding sites during muscle relaxation. So they kind of live on the strand. I'm just going to kind of draw that here. They kind of live on the strand. They kind of look like this. They're kind of like this like thread that kind of lives like that, and then there'd be like sort of an opposite thread covering all the other ones. So that's sort of what happens there. And what happens is like that thread lifts away and exposes the binding sites. And that's what allows the contraction to actually occur. So those regulatory proteins are going to be called your troponin and your tropomyosin. Tropomyosin is, it is basically what's actually blocking the binding site. It is the, it's the thread, right? And then troponin is basically little things that are tied to it, right? They kind of live on the tropomyosin, and they are attracted to calcium. So when you drive calcium into a muscle cell, that moves the troponin, which moves the tropomyosin, which exposes the binding sites and allows for a contraction to occur. Every single muscle contraction you've got, pretty freaking complicated stuff, right? But very, very cool too. I mean, look at it. You can see here's like this really thick band, right? And then here's all these little binding sites. So these heads are going to reach up and grab, and they're going to pull this way towards the center. Meanwhile, the same thing's happening on the right. They're grabbing here and they're pulling this way towards the center. So your muscle is relaxed. It looks like this. And then it shortens to look like that. And then it shortens even further to look like that. And that's a fully contracted muscle. And look how, see how like the actin strands and the myosin strands, they're kind of like barely gripping each other. And then they crawl across each other like this until we get all the way to a fully contracted muscle. And now there's no further room to move. This is fully contracted now. So these proteins slid across each other like this, which is, we have a term for that. And we call it the sliding filament theory, or the sliding filament model. And that is how muscle contractions actually take place. This is something that we're going to go much more in detail with to make it make even more sense in our other classes. But for now, this is kind of what I want you guys to keep in your brains, right? We've got our thin filament and our thick filament, and they are interacting with one another to slide across each other. And you can see it happening like right here. I can zoom in, right? We can kind of see that happening right here. They're just barely gripping each other, right? They barely got a grip. And then they start to slide, and now they got a really good grip, and then they slide even further until eventually they can't move any further than that. They are fully contracted, right? And then what'll happen is, you'll relax your muscle and everything will kind of go back into place. That's happening in every myofibril, in every muscle cell, in every muscle of your body, every time you move it. Pretty freaking complicated stuff, but very much worth studying. Questions on that, guys? How are we feeling? Bay, Saeed, how you guys doing?
It's great. Really, thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. Do you have any questions? Like, I know sometimes there's a lot of terminology there.
I want to ask you some question. Maybe right now you talk about the sum of the part for this book is a tutorial, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Is that true?
What?
I'm saying maybe you right now is talking about a little bit from this book, isn't it true?
Oh yeah. What we're talking these pictures.
Yeah,
right
that's
here,
for the
out of that book.
Yeah, exactly true.
Yeah.
Contractual element.
Yeah, so this is why we kind of use both books in conjunction, because your NASM book doesn't, I don't know, they do a good job of explaining it, but their pictures aren't as good. Yeah, there we go.
Cool.
So the pictures that are in your trail guide book are just so much better. So we really like to make sure that you guys have both of those.
It's amazing.
Because it sort of animates it in your brains. I love that trail guide book. Some of those pictures are so interesting.
Yeah, that's really amazing.
Yeah.
Completely true.
You guys want to hear another weird fun fact, by the way? So my favorite fun fact about this, so there are two groups of scientists who discovered this sliding action, the sliding filament theory. and it was discovered by two groups of scientists at the same time. So check this out. So I actually, it's sad that I don't remember their names in particular because I actually did a paper on this in school. But there were two totally independent teams in 1954, Andrew Huxley and Rolf Niedergerk, who were at Cambridge, and they used like this special microscope that they actually like designed specifically for this experiment, and they zoomed in on muscles to see the sliding happening. And then there was another group of a guy named Hugh Huxley and Gene Hansen from MIT, and they did the exact same scientist. So they both hypothesized the same thing. They did not know they were working on this at the same time. And so both groups of scientists were looking at the sliding thing, and they both published their findings. They wrote, you know, a article about it, and then they both published it. Get this, on the same day in the same medical journal. So whoever the editor was didn't notice that they both were writing about the exact same thing. It both got published at the exact same time. And that's crazy. That was happening in England and in America simultaneously. And there was a dude named Huxley on both teams, and they were unrelated to each other. They just happened to share the last name. That's crazy. That I always tell people, like, that is like, we live in the Matrix. That's a glitch in the Matrix. Anyway, it's my favorite fact.
Yeah.
What's that, Bay?
Yeah, that's a coincidence.
Right? I wrote a paper on that in college, and which was all about that. And it was in a class that was all about like physiology, and my teacher did not think it was cool at all, because like I was supposed to write about, like, you know, the physiology of stuff, and I wrote about this cool story, so I did not do very well. But anyway, so let's look at generating force within our muscles, right? So now let's talk about actually contracting our muscles. So remember, we said that our muscle, those are all the components inside of a muscle cell. Well, that muscle cell won't do any of that unless it's told to by your nervous system. So how does our nervous system tell our muscular system to do its stuff, right? Well, that is a term that we call neural activation, which is the contraction of a muscle generated by neural stimulation. So your nervous system tells your muscular system to do the sliding. And so, you know, there's a communication network, there's a link, right, between your central nervous system, and then it branches out to your peripheral nervous system, and then it interacts with your muscular system. And so it does this through motor units. This is probably one of the most important terms, or at least this is a term that we use a lot. And what a motor unit is it's a motor neuron. So it's the type of neuron that will tell a muscle to fire, and all of the individual muscle fibers that it will innervate. So remember, a muscle fiber is a muscle cell. Well, one neuron could zap several muscle cells. So let's look at a motor unit here. Here's one individual neuron, right? And it's attached to this muscle fiber and that muscle fiber and that one, right? It's attached to all four of these muscle fibers simultaneously. So if this was attached to like 4 little muscle fibers, honestly, this would probably be a pretty like weak neuron. This is probably like, you know, the muscles inside of your eyes, right? That's maybe 20 to 30 motor units are kind of moving your eyeballs around. Not exactly a strong contraction, but your glutes, right, which are huge, you know, that's the moneymaker, right? That is making really big, strong contractions. You got thousands of motor units firing simultaneously to create these really big, powerful contractions. So a motor unit is one neuron and then all the fibers that it's attached to, right? So motor neurons are attached to muscle fibers, and when that neuron's excited, it will innervate all of the muscle fibers. And those muscle fibers will all contract fully in order to do that. So you can see here it is like, traveling down from the central nervous system, and then it'll sort of branch out from the peripheral part of the nervous system, and it'll go to wherever it's going, and it'll signal the contraction within there, right? And that is how we are, told to generate this tension, right? Now, what's kind of interesting, actually, hold on, I gotta get to this next part first. So the way it does that, right? And this slide's really complicated. This is the part I was gonna warn you about. You guys don't have to have all of this memorized for this course. This is very much a physiology thing, not so much a kinesiology thing. But basically during neural activation, what happens is like an electric impulse will be transmitted down your nervous system. Okay, so it'll start in my brain, travel down my spine, work its way over to my, into my peripheral nervous system, travel across, and then it's going to get to the very end right as it's about to zap a muscle. So it'll travel down the axon of a neuron, and when it reaches the end, it will use these neurotransmitters, these little chemicals that'll be released in between the gap of like the neuron and the muscle fiber. So when we look at that, right, it'll look something kind of like this. There'll be, actually, I like that one better. There'll be a little gap right here. So a little gap between the neuron, right there's the end of the neuron, and the muscle fiber, okay? And in that muscle fiber, you can see, or in that neuron rather, you can see these little purple dots here. Those are, these little pockets that contain this chemical called acetylcholine, okay? And what'll happen is acetylcholine is this neurotransmitter. And when it binds to stuff on muscles, it causes muscle cells to contract. It causes them to release their energy and create that contraction, right? So, when the nervous system wants to interact with the muscular system, it releases acetylcholine into the muscle, and that triggers the contraction. Now, remember earlier, the things that make contractions are the actin and myosin, right? We got the myosin strand with all of its little heads, and we got the actin strand with its binding sites. But when that muscle is relaxed, those binding sites are blocked by the troponin and tropomyosin. So really what's happening is acetylcholine is telling the troponin and tropomyosin, the binding site blockers, to move out of the way. And when they move out of the way, that exposes the binding sites, the gripping happens, and it pulls, right? So how the heck do you get those to move out of the way? Well, you got to kind of bribe them. You got to bribe the troponin and tropomyosin in order to get out of the way. So troponin and tropomyosin are really attracted to calcium. And so what happens when acetylcholine binds to a muscle fiber, the muscle fiber releases any stored calcium that it has into that area. And so now there's all this calcium in there, and those blockers are attracted to that calcium. So they move away, and then that exposes the binding sites, right? The example there's a video that I show that gives a really good example of this. I'm going to steal that example from Crash Course, but think of it as high schoolers at like a high school dance. Okay. You've got like all these high school students, and they're all really attracted to one another, right? Like their hormones are going crazy. It's high school, teenagers, right? Like they're all very much attracted to one another, and they want to get up in each other's business, right? But you've got all the teachers there who are making sure, everything's still like kosher. They're there to make sure. They're like, hey. Well, no binding, like 6 inches between bodies, right? Well, those chaperones are like the troponin and tropomyosin keeping the binding from happening. And the teenagers, right, they're like the actin and the myosin. They want to bind and they want to slide together, right? So what happens is like the teachers can be bought off. Like you flush a little bit of calcium into the area, the teachers are like, what is that? And then they move away. And now suddenly these binding sites are just exposed to one another, and they're like, all right. And then all of a sudden all heck breaks loose. And we get the sliding happening in the sliding filament theory, right? So acetylcholine is this neurotransmitter that triggers the release of calcium into the muscle cell. And when that calcium gets released, the regulatory proteins, troponin and tropomyosin, they are attracted to calcium. Therefore, they move away and they expose actin's binding sites. And that allows your muscle cells to slide. And that's the sliding filament theory, right? That's what we're talking about. We say the sliding filament theory is we are talking about how calcium's being flushed, which allows actin to get bound to by myosin. Myosin reaches up and grabs that actin and it pulls it towards its center. And we see, there's a little gap here, right? And then all of a sudden, like it kind of pulls this way, right? There's a little gap here too. This pulls this way, and this pulls this way. And the muscle, which is nice and long, then suddenly contracts, and now it's all bunched up and shortened, right? Now there's not very much space. It's kind of hard to see in this version of the picture, but there we go. You can see like little bit of space, a little bit of space here, a little bit of space here, and then very little space on both sides, right? Lots on this side, but very little over here. So that shortening action happens, right? And that's what creates the contraction, causes your muscles to kind of bunch up. So that is what the sliding filament model is, right? It's the process of how these filaments take place. Here is the very detailed version of what I just said, by the way. Like if we go all the way through this entire process, right, a nerve impulse will travel from neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron until eventually it will get to an individual muscle fiber where it will release acetylcholine. Acetylcholine will grab that muscle fiber and that will trigger the release of calcium. Calcium will get flushed into the area. Troponin and tropomyosin will move away because it's attracted to the calcium. That exposes the binding sites. Myosin is going to reach up, grab actin, and pull. And that will cause the entire muscle myofibril to shorten. And then that myofibril shortening, while the one next to it's shortening, while the next to it's shortening, and all those myofibrils are all shortening at the same time. So then the muscle cell shortens. And then that happens next to that muscle cell, and that one, and that one, and that one. And so then the entire fascicle shortens. And then that fascicle shortening, while that fascicle shortening, so then the entire muscle shortens. Bundles, 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 bundles. You wouldn't think it would be so complicated, but there it is, right? It reaches up and grabs and pulls it. So step one, it's just kind of a big circle, right? Kind of pulls it into position, and then kind of lets go at the end. Now here's the thing. When a muscle cell fires, here's what's interesting. We obviously have strong contractions and we obviously have weak contractions, right? Like I can pick up my coffee mug here, right? And use the exact same muscles that I use when I go grab like a really heavy barbell during a deadlift, right? Or maybe a really heavy bicep curl would be a better example, right? So, this weighs maybe 1 pound, right? But like I could grab like a 55-pound barbell and, curl that thing. So how can I use the same cells that are able to lift 1 pound versus lifting like 50 pounds? Well, we have to be able to recruit less muscle fibers, right? Because here's what's kind of interesting. This is kind of a weird, fun fact about muscle cells. When your muscle cells fire, there's this thing called the all or nothing principle. And what this says is that regardless of the number of individual muscle fibers, when a motor unit contracts, it will always contract as hard as it can. It will contract fully every single time. So that starts to not make sense if you're like, well, then how do we have weak contractions, right? If I'm using, when a motor unit fires, if that makes all the muscle fibers contract as hard as they are able to, how is it like I'm able to open a door versus like wham, like slamming it open, right? Well, here's the thing. What if you only recruited some of your motor units? What if you, for like a really tiny movement, what if you started by recruiting maybe 10 motor units? And then all of a sudden your nervous system realized like, nope, that wasn't enough to move that dumbbell, right? What about 20 motor units? Maybe a little, but we're still not moving the dumbbell. What about 30 motor units? Okay, well, that got us about halfway up, right? 40 motor units, 50 motor units, right? Till eventually it's got to recruit as many as you can. This is one of the reasons why I always want to remind you guys of this. Strength is going to come from your nervous system working with your muscular system. It's not always about big muscles. Sometimes it's about nervous system strength. And so we need to be able to train to recruit lots of motor units, and we need to be able to train to develop our muscular system to physically grow. Both of those things need to happen if we are trying to get stronger. So this is also one of the reasons why, like, you shouldn't be worried about. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Bae.
Quick question. You said so basically the nervous system has the strength, the ability for the muscle strength. Is that what I understand?
Yeah, so if you have more motor units, right? If you have more connections, more neurons attached to more muscle fibers, right? You're going to have a much more powerful, stronger contraction, which is why sometimes you'll see like freaking Olympic powerlifters. You look at them and you're like, that guy. I mean, like let's look at like Jake. I mean, if I asked a novice, right, to look at this guy. And by the way, make no mistake, this guy's real strong. Like, what I'm about to say does not mean he is not incredibly strong. But if you were to look at him versus, let's say, Olympic weightlifter. If you're to look at him versus this guy, you know, who would you assume can lift more weight? Like that guy or this guy? You'd kind of be like, probably this guy, right? Like he's got much larger muscles, but that wouldn't necessarily be true. It could be true. I don't know how much these guys can lift. It could totally be true, but you'll see these really strong Olympic, like these really big, powerful people with these little tiny bodies sometimes. And you're like, how, you know?
Yeah, the Mr.
It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
And then you'll be like, how can that person lift so much weight? And it's because they have a really strong nervous system that knows how to very efficiently and very quickly get their muscular system to fire. They're getting everything to fire when they need to. This is also why, like, I mean, honestly, when you look at like the difference between like men and women's strength, like women, sometimes like I'll be training like my female clients and they're like, hey, I'm a little worried about bulking up. Like, I don't want to lift too heavy because if I lift really heavy, I'll get like really big muscles. And it's like, honestly, you actually won't. Like growing muscular size is just not a trait that comes very easy to most women. It takes a lot of effort because you don't produce as much testosterone. So without that testosterone, we're just not going to see as much, muscular size growth. But strength will develop very similarly. You'll see like strength go up. And so like when you look at like pound for pound, how strong like women are compared to men, it's really impressive sometimes. You'll see these like, incredibly strong women and they won't have like, huge, big bulking muscles because they don't need it. They have a very strong nervous system. Especially in the lower body, especially in like the freaking legs. Love training like training my female clients for like deadlifting and stuff. I love because they're just like, they'll get so strong. They'll wipe the floor with my male clients. So fun. So that all or nothing principle is what we need to remember. So regardless of the number of muscle fibers, when a motor unit contracts, it always contracts as hard as it can, right? Neurons and motor units can only contract for their full amount of strength. So the difference between a strong contraction and a weak contraction is the number of motor units required. Okay. So that's actually what's kind of interesting. If we look at like motor unit recruitment, let me see if I can find a picture of this. I'll draw my own chart if I need to. Motor unit recruitment. Found it. All right. It looks like this. This is sort of what happens, right? Maybe you recruit very few, just a couple neurons in order to do something weak, and then maybe a few more neurons if you do something a little bit stronger, right? But it kind of works like this. Your nervous system will always try to get the job done with as few motor units as possible. But then as it starts to realize how heavy the weight is, it will recruit more and more and more and more and more and more motor units until eventually you've got as many motor units firing as possible that's where you're like, with real heavy, just contracting as hard as you can. And you're really not going to get much harder than that, right? So the overall strength here is going to be determined by how many motor units you recruit. So how many muscle fibers are contained within a unit will affect that unit strength. So obviously, if you have a more muscle fibers, obviously that does result in strength. So we see strength come from the number of muscle fibers. So yeah, size, there's a connection there for sure. Size does result in strength. Make no mistake, but it's not the only thing, right? So precise movements are like little tiny moties, maybe 10 to 20 muscle fibers, right? But large ones can be 2,000 to 3,000 per motor unit, right? That's a huge contraction. So this is one of the reason, and Bay and Said, this is going to be new for you guys. You haven't heard this yet, but Andres, Isaiah, Dalen, Charlie, you guys have heard me say this before. Maximum strength, max strength lifting, it comes from three main things: motor unit recruitment, motor unit firing rate, so how fast they're able to kind of create, this contraction, and motor unit synchronization, all of them working simultaneously rather than like this guy pulling as hard as he can while the other one's like, changing its grip. We want everything pulling, we want everything working together rather than, kind of at different times. You lose a little bit of force doing that. So that's how we develop maximal strength. So how do you get motor unit recruitment? You lift really heavy. How do you get motor unit firing rate? You lift really fast. And how do you get motor unit synchronization? You take a lot of rest in between your sets to let your body reset. So we do maybe 1 to 5 repetitions, 85 to 100% of how much you are able to lift. So all the way really close to your 1 rep max. And you would take 3 to 5 minutes of rest, which are rules that you guys have heard before if you've been through program design. Other types of strength we can develop in other ways. If I'm trying to develop endurance, I would do the exact opposite. I'd do like 12 to 20 reps, and I would take very little rest. And that's going to give us different types of strength versus stabilization versus endurance versus power, So if it sounds, I want to mention that now because like, if it sounds like we've been talking a lot about like anatomy and physiology, and you're like, how the heck does all this biology stuff apply to the freaking gym? Well, our understanding of the anatomy is what determines how we give our clients sets and reps. I don't need my client to know that, the reason I'm only making them do 4 repetitions is because they're like, why am I only doing 4 reps? Shouldn't I do like 8 to 12? And that's like, well, you told me you're trying to improve your 1 rep max. You're trying to lift heavier. So if we do 8 to 12, that's not going to make you that much stronger. If we want to get stronger, we need to lift at a lower rep range. And I'm saying that because I know that how the sliding filament model works, right? I know that how my nervous system interacts with my muscular system. So that's where this ties into, kinesiology really, in biology really ties into our understanding of sets and reps, like all the real world stuff. All right, we're going to move into a new section. Any questions on that last section before we do, though? Nothing? All righty.
Thank you.
Cool. Let's take a, oh God, speaking of sore. I got my little baby forearms. It does not like deadlift day. Let's take a look at our muscle fiber types. So here's the thing about your muscle fibers as well. Like I said earlier, we name anatomy after how stuff looks. We name it after, what its visual characteristics are, or what its like performance characteristics are. So you got a couple different types of muscle fibers inside of your body, depending on how those cells look. So your muscle fiber types are, muscles are going to vary in their chemical and their mechanical. So their chemistry is going to look a little bit different, and their visual, like how they look, is also going to be a little bit different. They're going to have characteristics, right? And that's going to give them specific like things that they can do. I mean, if you look at like, again, the difference between, you look at the difference between like endurance and strength, right? yeah, you look at somebody like this is a pretty skinny dude, right? And over here is a little bit, a little bit more muscular, right? Strength training versus endurance training. They're kind of different things. They're going to develop different types of bodies. You're either going to look like The Rock or you're going to look like a runner, So developing those, you have different, they're on a cellular level. Those muscle fibers are actually going to look a little bit different. So the first, you're going to have two types. You're going to have type 1 and type 2 fibers. So your type 1 fibers, right? These are what we refer to as slow twitch muscle fibers. And sometimes you'll hear these referred to as like red fibers. They're smaller in size. So as a cell, they're actually a little bit tinier. And they're used for like endurance style lifting. These are often very much associated with the ideas of like stabilizing, like stabilization movements. Like your core is a really good example of like a lot of type 1 fibers. And they're very much associated with like postural control. Your rotator cuff is a lot of type 1 fibers, right? So these are very much your endurance fibers, right? They are usually a little bit smaller in size. They don't have as many like myofibrils. They don't have as many myofilaments. So they're much smaller, but they do have lots of mitochondria. And that allows them to produce lots and lots and lots of energy. So because they're producing energy so quickly, they can keep working for a really long time. You guys are using type 1 fibers right now, because I'm sure everybody in here is sitting up in some capacity, right? The little muscles that are just holding you upright, those are your type 1 fibers. So those are your endurance fibers. And then we've got our type 2 fibers, which are definitely what we're thinking of when we think of like big, strong lifts, right? So your type 2 fibers are your fast twitch muscle fibers. These are sometimes referred to as white fibers because they are much larger in size, but they don't have as much blood flow. So you'll see red versus white fibers. Red versus white wine. Yeah, that's what we're looking for. We can kind of see like the difference here, right? Red muscles with lots of mitochondria, lots of blood flow, right? Versus a white muscle, which has a lot less mitochondria and doesn't get as much blood flow, which is why they're called white fibers, right? So they're usually referred to, they're a lot larger in size, and these are used for your short-term, very, very, very powerful, heavy-duty contractions, right? So these, when you think of like, running muscles, right? Posture muscles, stabilizing muscles. You're thinking of type 1. And when you're thinking of lifting big, heavy barbells up off the ground, doing maximal strength lifting, those are going to be your type 2 fibers. And then we do have sort of a subcategory here, which are going to be your type 2A fibers or your type 2X fibers. So type 2X fibers, think X, think extreme. These are the fibers that really have a really low oxidative capacity. They really don't get a lot of blood flow, and they get tired really quickly, but they have a lot of motor units inside of them. So these are your true fast twitch fibers. Think like as explosive, where it's like, ah, and now I will sleep for 1,000 years. Like really intense and then done, one and done, right? Versus your type 2A fibers, which are fibers that are still type 2. They're still really large, but they've got a little bit of a higher oxidative capacity, so they're a little slower to fatigue. Honestly, when you're thinking of like an athlete, you want to have a pretty good mixture of type 2X and type 2A fibers. Like football players are a really good example of this because a football player needs to have a little bit of endurance. So they've got some type 2A fibers for sure, right? But they've also got to be able to create one big powerful contraction. You look at like a lineman, right? And they do like a really just heavy duty, intense, like maybe block or something, right? And it's like really explosive. They used all their type 2 fibers, and those things need a lot of time to rest, right? But suddenly they got to get to the line again immediately afterwards. And it's like, nope, you got to run the next play, right? Second down, right? Like, well, now the type 2A fibers are starting to take over. So it's not going to be quite as powerful as like your type 2X, but it has just a little bit of endurance. So think about like if you were lifting really close to your 1 rep max, that's your type 2X. If you were lifting for maybe 6 to 10 repetitions, that would be your type 2A. And then if you were lifting like up to 20 repetitions, you're probably getting into type 1 fiber territory. So here's some of the characteristics that we're going to see inside of the difference between type 1 and type 2. So type 1, they have a lot more capillaries. They're getting a lot more blood flow. Because they have more blood flow, they've got more mitochondria, which is spelled wrong, more mitochondria to use that blood flow, and more myoglobin to use that blood flow, right? So increased oxygen delivery, because they tend to be smaller in size, right? They aren't going to be as large as your type 2 fibers. They're going to produce a lot less force, but they're going to be a lot slower to fatigue. They can do things for, you can run a marathon, 26 miles, right? Your calves are creating little tiny contractions for 26 miles. That's a lot of type 1 endurance, right? These are definitely used for longer type contractions. I mean, marathon takes you a couple hours, right? And that's why we call them slow twitch. Your fast twitch fibers, they don't have as much blood flow. Therefore, they don't have as much mitochondria, spelled wrong again, and not as much myoglobin. Sorry, that is going to drive me up a wall. I was okay with it for a second, but then button. So fast twitch fibers, less capillaries, therefore less blood flow, therefore less mitochondria, therefore less myoglobin, decreased oxygen delivery. But they tend to be a lot larger in size. They're able to produce force, they can produce way more force, but they tend to be pretty quick to fatigue. These are used for your short-term contractions, things like, maximum force or maximum power. And then we've got, these are your fast twitch fibers. All right. Any questions on muscle fiber types?
No.
Cool. All right, guys. Last section of the day. Last little bit for today. So now we're moving out of the biology.
Thank you so
More
much.
biology. Oh, wait. What's that?
I'm saying thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. So no more biology, but now we got to look at movement, right? So your muscles provide the body with a variety of functions that allow them to manipulate forces on the body and produce or slow down movement. AKA your muscles are able to do all that fun biology stuff we just talked about, all the sliding and the relaxing and the sliding and the relaxing, in order to move around, and then that's, dragging your bones with it, right? So we're going to have to understand which muscles are doing which jobs. Like when I describe which muscle is performing this movement, that's very different than the muscle that's performing this movement, right? Or this movement, right? And so depending on what your muscle is doing, it is either going to be the main muscle that is lifting, or maybe it'll be a helper muscle there to assist in the lift, or maybe it's the opposite muscle. Let's look at our biceps and triceps, right? If I contract my bicep, my tricep has to relax. And if I contract my tricep, well, now my bicep has to relax. So here's what's fun about muscles. Weird fun fact. Muscles can only pull. Based on all the anatomy that we just talked about, the only thing that your muscle can do is pull and then relax back to length, right? Pull and relax. It cannot actively push in the opposite direction. And I know that seems really surprising because you're like, don't we have an exercise called the push-up? Yeah, we do. That's not what I'm talking about. The push-up is a pulling of the pectoralis muscle. It pulls my arm this way, and then that, raises me away from the ground. Muscles can only act in pulling and then relaxing back to normal length. So, your muscle is going to be responsible for different types of movements, right? Or each muscle is going to be responsible for different types of movements. So we have to have terms for this. Now, when we're talking about a muscle being the main muscle, right, the main muscle that we're referring to for a particular movement, we call that muscle an agonist, right? So if I'm talking about doing push-ups, right, which that movement is what we call, it's called horizontal adduction. When I'm doing push-ups, right, the main muscle, the one that's doing most of the work, is my pectoralis major. It's the one doing 90% of the work there, right? Meanwhile, my deltoid and my tricep muscles, they're there to help. They're assisting. So they are not agonists. They are synergists. They're there to sort of run assistance, right? Now, meanwhile, I've got the exact opposite muscle on the opposite side of my body. My upper back muscles, right, which are normally responsible for pulling me this way, right? They're relaxing as I'm pulling this way, right? As I'm doing my push-up, right? So they're going to be what are called antagonists, right? They're opposite muscles. So all of your muscles, like I said, they all have sort of an opposite, right? So we look here, right? If we think of like your muscles being arranged kind of like this, right? Imagine you've got, you don't really have any bones that actually look like this, but imagine like sort of a lever here on both sides. We have a question?
Yeah, sorry, Brad. What did we call
The
second one?
Oh, agonist,
Agonist,
synergist,
synergist, agonist,
the helper, and antagonist.
Antagonist. Okay.
Antagonist is the opposite.
Antagonist. Okay, sorry.
Yep. Oh, no, not at all. So we take a look right here. Right, here's my muscle, right? It would be attached on this side. Maybe it runs over there, and then there's another one, and it runs, right there, right? And then kind of grabs on both sides. Well, meanwhile, I've got the exact opposite muscle on the other side, right? And then it's gonna, oh my God, no. I can't draw. I'm just not meant to be an artist. So there's that one, right? And then there's, that one right there. So there is like, these are on opposite sides of a joint. So let's say this is like my bicep, and this is my tricep. They are antagonists, right? So here's the thing. They are total opposites of each other. Now, during what we, if I'm referring to a particular movement, let's say elbow flexion. So elbow flexion is this. That's elbow flexion, right? This is elbow extension. Elbow flexion, elbow extension. Now, every muscle in your body, here's what we got to remember. Every muscle in your body, and we can see this right here. Keep in mind, in the course of one simple action, a muscle's role can change. It might start the movement as the agonist. It might start the movement being the main muscle that does all the work. But then it kind of hands that job off to another muscle, and suddenly now it's a synergist, right? So every muscle in your body can be an agonist or an antagonist or a synergist or a stabilizer, and we'll talk about those in a minute. So, it's not like my pec is always an agonist muscle. That's not how we're going to label muscles. We're just referring to which muscles are agonists during which particular movements. So remember, we're studying kinesiology, right? So in this course, I'm going to teach you guys, the different types of shoulder flexion or elbow flexion or shoulder extension or elbow extension or horizontal adduction, abduction, regular abduction, regular adduction, rotation, right? So we're going to teach you all of these particular movements in all these different joints inside the body. Well, we need to know which muscles are agonists during those movements. So during a bicep curl, my agonist is my bicep and my antagonist is my tricep. And that allows me to know a little bit about like which muscles are doing which things inside the body. Now that I know what muscles do what, I can look at your body and go, you're tilted like this. That means that the agonist over here is pulling too hard and the agonist over here can't pull hard enough. So what's the antagonist to that muscle that can't pull hard enough? And I'm like, oh, okay, it's this agonist. It's this guy, right? There's the, so I need to loosen that antagonist to let that agonist do its job. gets a little complicated, but here, let's go through our definitions here, right? So an agonist is the muscle that's a prime.
Sometimes,
Oh yeah.
Brad, when the sometimes is a actually the pull up from the side.
Mhm.
Okay, this side it's an agonist, isn't it? The other side is a
Yep.
antagonist, isn't it true?
Exactly.
That's true.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So
Mm.
during lateral movements, this is called lateral flexion. And
Mhm.
yeah, like the muscle on this side would be an agonist and this would be the antagonist. So if I was stuck like this, let's say I like walked like this all day,
I
right?
know.
I need to loosen up over here and strengthen up over here. And that's going to draw me back to neutral, right? You ever see those guys in the gym, you know, I'm talking about where they have the invisible lat syndrome?
Mhm.
Like they kind of walk around like this all day. And you'll see sometimes they'll just have like a perpetually bent elbow. They're kind of stuck like this. And it's like, hey, you know, straighten out your arm, right?
know.
They stay in this kind of like overly bent position, right? They kind of look a little stiff, right? They look like C-3PO. So that is sometimes because those are the same dudes just all day. Bicep curls and more bicep curls and more bicep curls. And it's like, hey man, you need to do some freaking tricep presses to, you know, get your arm unbent, right? Or when we see someone whose knees cave in, right? If my knees cave like this while I'm squatting, these muscles on my inner thigh, these, when they're they're pulling too much. And then these muscles on my hips that pull me this way, they're not squeezing enough. That's an overactive versus an underactive muscle. So based on what I know here, I can look at someone's posture and say that is acting as an agonist when it should be acting as a synergist, right? It should only be helping, but it's doing too much work. And that's how we analyze. This is why, you know, this understanding of muscles is so important. So the agonist is the muscle that's primarily moves like a joint, depending on what it is you're talking about. So it's the one, you know, it's in reference to whatever it is, right? This is the prime mover. So if we're talking about a squat, right, the gluteus maximus is the agonist for hip extension. So when I'm describing this movement right here, right, which is hip extension, drawing my femur behind me, that's hip extension. The main muscle that does that is my glute, right? Now it's getting help from these synergist muscles in my hamstring. So my hamstring actually assists when I do this, right? So now I've got two muscles working together to create the same movement.
Mhm.
So a synergist muscle, that's going to assist your prime mover. So the hamstrings are a synergist during hip extension. So the gluteus maximus is doing most of the work and the hamstrings are now helping. Meanwhile, you've got exactly the opposite muscle on the other side. So muscles that work in the exact opposite direction, they do totally the opposite thing, right? Because muscles can only pull. So they have to be arranged like this. We have to have, you know, if I'm going to pull
Biceps or triceps.
Yeah, if I got to pull this way, well, I also need to be able to pull this way. So in this case, the opposite of my glute is going to be right around to the other side of my body in my hip flexor. So this muscle does this, you know, it drives my hip up towards me. So we got hip flexion versus hip extension. Flexion, extension. Hip flexors, gluteus maximus, right? So that's my sort of opposite setup there. So the hip flexors are antagonists during hip extension. Now, if I were describing hip flexion, instead of describing a squat, maybe I'm describing like a hanging leg raise. Well, now, right, the agonist is going to be in my hip flexors and the antagonist is my glutes. So we've got to be able to, you know, we got to flip these muscles around depending on what it is we're talking about. So here's how I like to describe it, because I think this is kind of a fun way. If you think about like the agonist as the main, you know, muscle that we're referring to, it's sort of the main character of our story, right? Like it's Batman, right? Like Batman is out there fighting crime in Gotham, right? And then you've got synergist muscles, which are there to help. Well, synergist is like Robin. Robin's there to help Batman, right? Like, he's, fighting like all the goons on the side. Like Batman's there fighting the Joker and Two-Face and stuff, and Robin's taking care of the goons in the background, but then you've got the antagonist that's like working directly against your prime mover, right? Your antagonist is the exact opposite. That's like the Joker, right? He's there to antagonize Batman, right? Totally the opposite. Well, those are all like how our muscles are sort of arranged. So every muscle could be an agonist one moment and a synergist the next, or maybe it's an antagonist. It just depends on what movement you're talking about. So if I'm trying to analyze, let's say somebody's got altered posture, right? Let's say instead of, their muscle looking like this, maybe their muscle looks like this instead. Actually, let's go this way. Maybe it's being their joints pulled the wrong way. So now I've got one muscle that's like kind of stretched out, even though it's not supposed to be. It's really thin and stretched. And I got one big fat muscle that's really contracting a little bit too hard over here, right? So this is overactive, right? And this one's underactive. So I need to figure out when this muscle is an agonist. I need to figure out when this muscle is mostly supposed to do its job. And then I need to do that movement over and over and over and over and over again. And I, meanwhile, need to do the exact opposite of that movement for this muscle. I need to get this muscle to relax. And that will hopefully draw me back to, a 90-degree angle here, right? And hopefully we'll get back to a place where my muscles are shaped the way they're supposed to be shaped, rather than, pulling me into bad posture. So lastly, you do have stabilizers too, by the way. Stabilizers are muscles that support and stabilize the body, while your agonists and your synergists and your antagonists, while they're doing all this like big broad movement, the abdominal complex that stabilizes your spine while you're squatting, right? Your rotator cuff stabilizes your shoulder while you're doing like shoulder presses and push-ups and things like that. In our Batman analogy, this is like Alfred the butler. He's there to make sure that, Batman's got tea and crumpets or whatever, to providing emotional stability. So that is sort of how I like to think about those, right? So here's some really good examples that we've got up here, just as a sort of a very simple working list. If we look at like a chest press, your pectoralis major is the prime mover. Meanwhile, your anterior deltoid and your triceps are synergists, right? So chest press, during that movement, your pec is the agonist and your deltoids are the synergists. Meanwhile, your rotator cuff is your stabilizer, and your posterior deltoid in the back here is your antagonist. If we look at an overhead press, like a shoulder press, right? Your deltoid is now an agonist, right? Whereas before, remember, we just said it was a synergist over here. Well, now during, if I'm doing that, it's a synergist. If I'm doing this, it's an agonist. So now it's the main muscle, right? Meanwhile, my tricep is there to assist. That's a synergist. Again, my rotator cuff is stabilizing. And then my latissimus dorsi underneath my armpit, right? That's the antagonist. This muscle needs to relax when I do my shoulder presses. So we got a lot of different examples there. And that is your entire guide to the kinetic chain, guys. 3 days of talking about the nervous, skeletal, and muscular systems. How you feeling?
Great.
Great?
Amazing.
Awesome.
Right. So
Isaiah, Dalen, I know you guys, Charlie, I know you guys have seen this before.
I'm good.
Hopefully we got a little bit of a different perspective on it today. A little bit of new stuff, hopefully.
Run down. Good to go.
But yeah, that's you've only got to go through this one more time, I think.
I'll be able to like
how about this squat?
say them all verbatim by that
Right.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to review this. This is a lot of information.
I know the muscle ones, muscles a lot. It's like I said, this is our most dense day. Don't get me wrong. Like when we get into all of like the start labeling muscles and stuff, the note pages will look really long, but they move very fast because we're just labeling directly what's in your textbook. But in terms of like terminology, we got a lot of terms today. Yeah, so on Monday, it's kind of fun. We're going to dive a little bit into kinesiology and body movements. So we'll start labeling what it means. Like, you know, if I move my neck like this, what is that? That's neck lateral flexion, right? Or if I go this way, that's neck regular flexion. So we'll actually kind of look at like what that is, elbow flexion versus elbow extension. We'll start getting some of those terms down. And then we can tie the muscles together. We can say, okay, well, what muscle does neck flexion? What muscle does neck lateral flexion? They're different muscles, right? So that'll be kind of fun. Any questions today at all? Okay, you guys ready for your weekend?
Thank you so much.
Yep, ready to go.
Supposed to be some nice weather this weekend.
It is, man. We're out of the rain. So everybody go on a hike and use your hip flexion and hip extension.
Go do it later, Brad. Have a good weekend.
Yeah, you too. We'll see you guys.
Thank you so much for today.
Yeah,
Have a
you're
wonderful
welcome.
day.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you, Brad. Have a
Everybody-
great weekend.
Yeah, you
Have a good
too.
weekend. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Brad.
Bye.
You're welcome. See you guys.